Callum Reeves walked into the restaurant for a blind date he had nearly canceled 3 different times. The woman sitting at the corner table looked at him for a few seconds, her expression calm, almost as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. Then she gave a small smile and said, "You don't remember me? Do you, Mr. Reeves?" Callum was about to say no, but as a memory began to return, a conference room 7 years ago, a presentation cut short, and the word amateur he had used in front of the entire company, he suddenly understood something. To him, it had been just another ordinary Tuesday meeting, but to her, it had been the day that changed her life. Chicago in late October had a particular kind of cold, the kind that didn't ask permission, that slipped through your coat and settled somewhere behind the ribs. Callum Reeves knew that cold well. He'd been living with a version of it for 3 years, ever since the morning he stood in a hospital hallway, and a doctor said words that rearranged every plan he'd ever made for his life. He was 38 now, the managing director of Reeves Capital Advisors, a boutique financial consulting firm with offices on the 42nd floor of a building that looked out over Lake Michigan. From that height on a clear day, the water looked almost peaceful. Callum rarely noticed it anymore. He arrived before 7 and left after 8, and the view was just something that happened in the background while he made other people's money work harder than they did. His daughter Piper was 9 years old and had her mother's eyes quick, dark, and full of opinions she hadn't yet learned to keep to herself. She lived with him in a penthouse apartment in the Gold Coast neighborhood, in rooms that were too large and too quiet, and full of furniture that had been chosen by someone with better taste than either of them currently possessed. A housekeeper named Dolores came 3 times a week and left meals in the refrigerator with handwritten labels in careful cursive. Piper called her Miss Dolores and had at some point taught the woman how to play Go Fish, which was more than Callum had managed in the past 6 months. He loved his daughter in the absolute unqualified way that people love things they are terrified of losing. He just wasn't sure he was any good at showing it, and lately Piper had stopped trying to make it easy for him. His closest colleague, a man named Brett Halford, barrel-chested, relentlessly optimistic, the kind of person who remembered birthdays, had been watching all of this with growing concern for the better part of a year. Brett was the one who suggested the blind date. He framed it as casual, threw in phrases like, "just dinner," and "she's interesting, you'll like her." And Callum had agreed, mostly to stop Brett from sending him another article about the psychological effects of prolonged isolation. He put on a suit that didn't need to be pressed, drove to a restaurant in River North called Alder and Salt, and walked in feeling like a man reporting to a meeting he hadn't fully prepared for. He didn't recognize her at first. That would be the detail that stayed with him longest. Afterward, the fact that he sat down, accepted the menu from the hostess, and looked across the table at Bryn Calloway for a full 5 seconds without any recognition at all. She was 35, composed in the way that people are composed when they've worked very hard to become that way, wearing a charcoal blazer and small gold earrings. Her hair was shorter than he remembered, though he didn't know yet that he remembered her at all. She had the kind of stillness that made the room around her feel slightly louder by contrast. She looked at him the way a chess player looks at an opening. Move interested, patient, already 3 steps ahead. "You don't remember me, do you, Mr. Reeves?" she said, and the sound of his own last name in that particular tone, measured without hostility, without warmth, hit him like a glass of ice water to the face. His hands went still on the menu. Something shifted behind his eyes, a slow, terrible turning, the way a ship turns in a narrow channel. And then it came back, not all at once, in pieces. A conference room, fluorescent light, a round table with too many chairs, a young woman standing at the front of the room holding a presentation binder, her voice going quieter and quieter as his own grew sharper. The words he'd used: amateur, sloppy, a waste of everyone's time in this room. He hadn't even looked at her face when he said it. He'd been looking at the spreadsheet. Bryn picked up her water glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down without breaking eye contact. "I didn't think so," she said. "Not cruel, not satisfied, just factual." Callum set the menu down. His first instinct was to stand up, to say something smooth and professional, to create distance the way he always created distance, by moving faster than the discomfort could follow. But his legs didn't cooperate. He sat there in the amber light of alder and salt, with the smell of cedar and warm bread in the air, and the low sound of a jazz standard playing somewhere he couldn't see. And he made the decision, or maybe it was made for him to stay. "Tell me your name," he said, though he already knew it was coming back. "Tell me everything." Bryn Calloway had been 28 years old when she walked into Reeves Capital Advisors, with 2 references, a graduate degree in organizational development, and the kind of ambition that hadn't yet learned to protect itself. It was her first position at a firm of that size, and she'd treated it accordingly, arriving early, staying late, volunteering for projects that had nothing to do with her job description. She was junior staff, which at a place like Reeves meant you were mostly invisible, which she had accepted as temporary. She prepared her first independent report for 6 weeks. It was on workforce productivity patterns in mid-size financial firms, and she'd believed in it the way you believe in something you've built from nothing. Callum had requested the presentation on a Tuesday morning with less than 48 hours' notice. She'd stood at the front of the conference room with 9 people staring at her, including Callum at the head of the table. His jacket off his sleeves rolled a pen tapping against his legal pad in a rhythm that made it clear from the first slide that he'd already formed his conclusion. He let her get through 4 slides before he stopped her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He said the methodology was unsound, the conclusions were unsupported, and the entire presentation reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what the firm actually needed. He used the word amateur twice. He asked if anyone else had feedback, and the silence in the room was its own kind of answer. Bryn had said, "I understand. Thank you for your time," gathered her binder and walked out. She submitted her resignation 2 weeks later. She never spoke to Callum Reeves again, until now. She told him most of this over the appetizer course in the same level tone she'd used from the beginning, while Callum sat across from her and did not look away and did not attempt to interrupt. This was itself unusual for him, and some part of him recognized it. When she finished, she cut a piece of roasted beet with the side of her fork and said, "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad. I want you to understand who I am now, and the only honest way to do that is to tell you where I started." Where she was now was this director of talent development at Halcyon Group, one of the largest private equity firms in the Midwest. She ran a department of 11 people, managed a budget that had 3 commas in it, and had, in the past 7 years, built a reputation for identifying and developing human potential in organizations that had previously treated their people as interchangeable parts. She was not angry. That was the thing Callum kept returning to as the evening wore on. She was not angry. She was something more unsettling than angry. She was fine. She was better than fine. She had taken the worst professional day of her life and used it as the first brick of something real. Callum ordered a whiskey he didn't drink. He told her about Sandra, his wife, because it felt dishonest not to, and because he'd gotten to the age where he no longer had the energy to edit himself in all the ways he used to. He told her about Piper, about the school conference he'd missed last spring, about the drawing Piper had made of their apartment that showed his office door closed and her bedroom door closed, and no one in the living room at all. He said, "I don't know when I became the kind of person who needs a floor plan to understand what I'm doing wrong." And it was the most honest thing he'd said to another adult in months. Bryn listened. She didn't fill the silence with reassurance, which he found simultaneously uncomfortable and respectful. He tried to apologize before they left. He said the words, and they were true words, but they came out with the cadence of a man who was more accustomed to presenting solutions than sitting with consequences. Bryn looked at him steadily. "I appreciate you saying that," she said, and meant it, and also made clear with the angle of her shoulders and the way she reached for her coat that the evening was over and the account was not yet settled. He watched her walk out into the October cold and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment before flagging a cab. He didn't sleep well that night. The weeks that followed were difficult in the specific way that things are difficult when you can't stop thinking about them. Callum went back to his routine early mornings, back-to-back calls dinner, from Dolores's containers, eaten standing at the kitchen counter. But Bryn Calloway occupied some corner of his attention that he couldn't clear. He wasn't sure if it was guilt, which was familiar, or something else which was less so. Brett noticed the distraction and had the wisdom for once to say nothing about it. Meanwhile, Piper's school called on a Wednesday morning. Her fourth-grade teacher, a patient woman named Mrs. Aldrich, said that Piper had been sitting alone at lunch for 3 weeks, that she'd stopped raising her hand in class, and that on Monday she had spent recess in the library because, in Piper's own words, "The other kids think I'm weird." Callum sat in his car in the parking garage and held his phone after the call ended and felt the particular helplessness of a person who is very good at solving problems that have quantifiable solutions. He drove home that evening at 6:30, which was the earliest he'd left the office in 4 months. Piper was at the kitchen table doing homework, and she looked up with an expression of such careful neutrality, the face of a child who has learned not to expect too much, that Callum had to look away before he could speak. He made them grilled cheese sandwiches, which was the only thing he cooked reliably, and they ate together at the kitchen table for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember. Piper told him about a book she was reading about a girl who could talk to crows. She told him about a math problem that had a trick to it. She did not tell him about lunch or recess, and he didn't push because he didn't know how, and that inadequacy sat in his chest like a stone he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped noticing the weight. 2 weeks after the dinner at Alder and Salt, Callum was in a building on Michigan Avenue for a conference on institutional investment strategy. He arrived early, found a seat, and was reviewing notes when he heard Piper's voice, which was impossible because Piper was at school. And yet, there it was, her particular laugh, the one that started low and then cracked upward on the second beat. He turned. Across the lobby through a set of glass doors that led to what looked like a separate event space, he could see a group of children seated in a circle on the floor. A banner above the door read, "Halcyon Rising Youth Leadership and Communication Workshop." And kneeling on the floor next to his daughter, her blazer replaced by a soft blue cardigan, was Bryn Calloway. She was saying something that made Piper laugh again, and then she handed Piper a marker and pointed to a large sheet of paper on the floor between them. And Piper uncapped the marker with both hands and bent forward with the focused intensity she brought to things that actually interested her. Callum stood at the glass and did not move for a long moment. He watched Bryn move from child to child, around the circle, crouching to each one's level, listening with her full face, responding in a way that made each kid sit up slightly straighter afterward. She was extraordinary at it. That was the only word. She did it without performance, without self-consciousness, without any apparent awareness that she was doing something worth observing. It was the opposite of every meeting he'd ever watched himself run. He was still standing there when the workshop ended, and children began filing out through the lobby to waiting parents and nannies. Piper saw him first, broke into a run, and hit him at waist height. He wrapped his arms around her, and she said, "But Dad, there was this lady, and she said that being different isn't a disadvantage. It's just data you haven't explained yet, and she let me pick the marker color." She pulled back and looked at him with the open face she used to wear all the time. "Do you know her? She kinda looked at you weird." Callum looked up. Bryn was standing 20 feet away, her bag over one shoulder, watching him with a neutral expression that contained, if you knew where to look, something careful and assessing. He felt the moment the way you feel a step that isn't there, the brief, disorienting drop. He put his hand on Piper's shoulder and said, "No, I haven't met her." And the words were barely out before he understood exactly what he'd done. Bryn heard it. He could tell by the way her chin moved a fraction of an inch, and her gaze went slightly flat. She turned, said something brief to a colleague beside her, and walked toward the exit without another look in his direction. Piper was still talking about the marker colors. Callum watched the glass door close behind Bryn and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not guilt, which was familiar, but shame, which was different, which was worse, which meant you'd known better and done it anyway. The next morning, Brett appeared in Callum's office doorway with a coffee he hadn't asked for and the expression of a man preparing to confess something. Callum was on a call. He held up one finger, finished the call, and looked at Brett. "You knew who she was," Callum said, because he'd had 24 hours to think about it, and the arithmetic only worked one way. Brett sat down, wrapped both hands around his own mug, and said, "Yes." He said he'd known Bryn Calloway by professional reputation for 2 years before he learned that she'd worked briefly at Reeves Capital before Callum knew Brett. He said he'd run into her at a conference last spring, and she'd been sharp and funny and completely unbothered by a past that could have defined her, and he'd thought, not as a scheme, just as an instinct, that she and Callum were the kind of people who needed to be in the same room. "You needed someone who wasn't afraid of you," Brett said. "She's the only person I know who has a documented reason to be, and clearly isn't." Callum said nothing for a long time. Then he told Brett to get out of his office, and Brett went without argument, which was its own kind of answer. That evening, Halcyon Group sent Reeves Capital a proposal for a joint advisory engagement, a 6-month project, restructuring the talent architecture of a manufacturing group they jointly acquired. The lead contact from Halcyon was listed as Bryn Calloway. Callum read the email 3 times. He forwarded it to his operations lead with a note that said, "Proceed to contract," and then sat back in his chair and stared at the lake until the light changed. The first 2 weeks of the joint project were professional in the precise, careful way that 2 people are professional when they are working very hard not to acknowledge something. Bryn ran her portions of the engagement with the same quiet authority Callum had watched her use with the children in that lobby, and her team reflected it, organized, prepared, genuinely invested in the work. Callum's team was excellent too, in a more pressurized way, the kind of excellence that comes from fear of falling short. In the joint meetings, he found himself noticing the difference and not liking what it implied about his management style. He tried twice to create a moment outside of work context. Once holding the elevator saying something about the project timeline that was transparently an excuse for conversation. Once in the hallway after a late session suggesting coffee. Both times, Bryn was pleasant and impenetrable, the way a well-designed wall can seem perfectly cordial. She was not rude. She was simply unavailable, and she did it so gracefully that there was nothing to push back against. The call from Piper's school came on a Thursday at 4:15. It wasn't Mrs. Aldrich this time. It was the school counselor, Dr. Ferris, who had a calm voice and chose her words with obvious care. She said Piper had been targeted by a group of girls who had been systematically excluding her from group work, had taken her lunch bag on 2 separate occasions, and had told other kids in the class that Piper was strange and babyish. She said Piper had not told any adult because she was afraid it would make it worse. She said Piper had been crying in the bathroom between classes. Callum sat at his desk with both hands flat on the surface and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past the window, and the lake outside was very dark and very still and offered nothing. He called Bryn's cell without entirely deciding to. He hadn't planned what he would say, which was unusual for him. He spent his professional life planning what he would say, before he said it. Her voicemail picked up after 4 rings. He hung up without leaving a message. He drove to her building. He had the address from the project files, and he was aware on some level that this was exactly the kind of move he would have called disproportionate if someone had described it to him. He did it anyway because the stone in his chest had gotten heavier in the past hour, and he didn't know what else to do with it. The building was in Wicker Park, a clean brick mid-rise, with a lobby that smelled like eucalyptus. The front desk called up. There was a long pause. Then Bryn came down. She was in a sweater and jeans, no blazer hair, loose, a different kind of composed than the conference room version, quieter, more guarded, real in the way people are real when you see them on a Thursday evening in their own building. She looked at him and said, "You need to call ahead." He said, "I know. I'm sorry. Piper's having a hard time, and I don't know how to help her. And you're the only person she talked about for 2 weeks after that workshop." The words came out faster than he meant them to. He stopped, pressed his lips together. The lobby was quiet around them. A delivery man passed with a cart. Bryn looked at him for a long moment. She said, "That's not my responsibility." He said, "I know." She said, "You told her you didn't know me." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" And he said the true thing, which was, "Because I panicked. Because I'm still the person who looks away from things that are complicated, and I'm trying not to be. And I'm not very good at it yet." The lobby was very quiet. The delivery man had gone. Bryn looked at the door, then back at Callum. "Go home to your daughter," she said. "That's what she needs right now." He went. She didn't come down to the street to watch him leave, but she stood at the lobby window for a moment longer than necessary before turning away. The following Monday, Bryn sent a message to the joint project channel, noting a scheduling conflict and requesting to reschedule the Tuesday meeting. Callum approved the change and added no comment. The week went by. Piper came home from school on Wednesday and said that the counselor had met with the whole class and that 2 girls had apologized and that she'd eaten lunch with a boy named Declan, who was also reading a book about animals who could talk. She said it like it was a small thing, but she said it at dinner, which they were eating together again now, which was its own kind of evidence. On Saturday morning, Callum sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Piper was still in pajamas, cross-legged on the couch with her book, and the apartment had the slow, unhurried quality of a weekend morning that wasn't going anywhere. He found a piece of stationery in a drawer, actual paper, the good kind left from Sandra's things, with a small embossed border at the top. He sat for a while before he wrote anything, and then he wrote for 40 minutes without stopping, which was the longest he'd sat still without a screen or a phone in recent memory. He wrote about the conference room. He wrote that he remembered the binder she'd been holding, and the way she'd said, "I understand," with a steadiness that he hadn't recognized at the time as courage. He wrote that he had been at 31, the kind of person who confused speed with intelligence and volume with authority, and that he'd damaged people with that combination in ways he was still finding out about. He wrote that he wasn't writing to ask for forgiveness, because forgiveness was hers to give or not, as she decided, and because he suspected she'd made her peace with what happened long before he'd made his, which meant the apology was mostly for him, and he was trying to be honest about that. He wrote that he was grateful she'd been kind to Piper at the workshop, and that watching her in that circle of children had been one of the more clarifying things he'd witnessed in a long time. He wrote that he hoped she knew what she'd built, and that it was real, and that it was enough. He signed it with his first name only, not his title, not his last name, just Callum, which felt appropriately small. He dropped the envelope with the building concierge in Wicker Park on Sunday afternoon, while Piper waited in the car, listening to an audiobook about talking crows with the volume turned up and 1 foot on the dashboard. Bryn read the letter on Tuesday evening after everyone else in the office had gone home. She sat at her desk with the lamp on and the rest of the room dark, and read it twice, which was once more than she'd expected to. She had not spent the past 7 years angry at Callum Reeves, She'd spent them building something that had nothing to do with him, which was a better use of energy and also more effective. But the letter reached something that she hadn't known was still reachable. A small locked room in her professional self that she'd furnished with the memory of that conference room and labeled evidence and returned to whenever she needed to remember why she didn't give anyone the benefit of the doubt. She sat with it for a long time. The lamp made a warm circle on the desk. Outside, the city made its usual sounds. She noticed, not unmoved. She called him the next morning before the workday started, because she was someone who dealt with things directly and efficiently, and also because she'd been thinking about Piper. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he'd been hoping she would call. She didn't remark on it. She said, "I got your letter." A pause. "Thank you for writing it by hand." Another pause. "Piper told me at the workshop that she likes the park near the Art Institute, the one with the big fountain. I'll be there Saturday at 10 if you happen to be in the area." It was not a declaration. It was not a romantic overture carefully defined. It was an opening, which was different, more valuable, more honest, more hers to give. Callum said, "We'll be in the area," and she could hear in his voice the effort it took to say something simple without overqualifying it, which she recognized as progress. On Saturday, the park was cold, but bright, the fountain off for the season, but still a landmark pigeons negotiating the edge of it, with their usual lack of dignity. Callum and Piper arrived a few minutes before 10. Piper had her hair in 2 uneven braids that suggested Callum had attempted and mostly succeeded, and she was wearing a coat with a small embroidered bird on the lapel that she'd chosen herself. She saw Bryn first and broke into a run, which was, Callum thought, probably the most honest review his situation had received in months. He walked the remaining distance alone, hands in his coat pockets, the cold coming off the lake behind the tree line. Bryn and Piper were already deep in conversation when he arrived. He stood at the edge of it for a moment, without interrupting, watching Piper use her hands to describe something, watching Bryn lean forward slightly to follow the explanation, the same attention he'd seen in the workshop, but different. Now, smaller scale, more personal. He thought about the drawing Piper had made all the closed doors. He thought about the letter and the stationery, and Sandra's handwriting on the dinner containers in the refrigerator. He thought about being 31 and standing at the head of a conference table and not looking at anyone's face. A pigeon landed near his foot and considered him briefly before moving on. "Dad." Piper looked back at him. "Bryn says there's a crow colony near Lincoln Square that's been there since the 1980s. Can we go?" He looked at Bryn. She was looking at him with an expression that was for the first time slightly warmer than neutral, careful still measured, but open in a way that cost something and was therefore worth something. He said, "We can go." And then, because some things are better, said plainly, "Thank you for being here." Bryn held his gaze for a moment. "Don't make me regret it," she said, but the corner of her mouth was moving in a way that took some of the edge off it, and Piper was already walking ahead of them on the path toward the gate braids, slightly unraveling, narrating something at full volume to no one in particular. They fell into step together, not close, not far in the particular way of two people who are beginning a distance. They aren't sure yet how long will be, but who have decided that the beginning is worth the uncertainty. The park around them held the quiet, specific to late autumn leaves down branches, bare sky, the pewter color that Chicago wore, like a second coat from October to March. But the light was clear. Under it, Callum Reeves looked slightly less like a man carrying something he couldn't set down. Several months passed, the way good months do not perfectly, but with accumulation. Bryn and Callum ran the remainder of the Halcyon project, with something that started as professional respect and extended gradually and without formal announcement into the hours outside of work. Piper finished the Crow book and moved on to one about a girl who could see the future, which she summarized for Bryn in installments over Saturday visits with the thoroughness of a person who expects her audience to keep up. Declan the lunch boy came to the apartment twice for what Piper called study sessions, and Callum recognized as the elementary school version of a social life cautiously rebuilt. Brett Halford, who had the decency to say nothing for an unusually long stretch, finally said in the elevator one morning, "You seem different." Callum said, "Different how?" Brett thought about it. Like someone turned the volume down. It was not a flattering image. It was accurate. On a morning in late February, a Tuesday ordinary in every external particular, Callum drove Piper to school. She was in the back seat with her backpack and a thermos of hot chocolate that Callum had made without burning, which was a recent development. At a red light on Clark Street, she looked up from her book and said, "Do you like Bryn?" Callum watched the light. "Yes," he said, because Piper asked direct questions and deserved direct answers, and had in any case already formed her own conclusion. "I mean, like. Piper clarified with the gravity of someone resolving an important ambiguity. The light turned green. He pulled forward. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But I know that this time I'm not going to look away." Piper considered this for 2 full blocks, then nodded and went back to her book, apparently satisfied. Across the city, in an office in the Loop, Bryn Calloway arrived early, which was her habit. She set her bag down, took off her coat, and before opening her laptop, she opened the top drawer of her desk. Inside was a folded envelope slightly worn at the creases from handling. She looked at it for a moment, not long, just a moment, then closed the drawer, opened her laptop, and started her day. Outside the window, the lake was beginning to lighten at the edges, where February sun was doing its best against the cold. It wasn't warm yet, but it was coming.